What's up everyone, how are you all? Today we are back with another blazing Naruto story. What if Naruto was banished and returned with the power to erase villages instantly? If you enjoy then please like, share and do comments. Sitting at her desk in the Hokage Tower, Tsunade sighed as she realized her stash was empty. It wasn't surprising given the rate she went through the stuff. The last 3 years had not been good for Konoha. The fallout of Nariko's banishment had been unexpectedly severe. First Wave Country had cancelled all their trade treaties, saying that they wouldn't have any kind of alliance with the village that banished their hero. She had read Kakashi's mission report and didn't understand what they meant, since it said the mission's success was due to Sasuke and his activation of the Sharingan. There was a note saying that Nariko had accessed Kyuubi's chakra, but other than that there was little mention of her role. The council had tried to negotiate, but Tazuna, the mayor of Wave, had refused to even meet any of the envoys. That had been bad enough for Konoha's economy, but it was only the beginning. The alliance with Suna was at an all-time low, all trade and cooperation had been cancelled. The best she could expect from the new case cage was assistance in time of war. Again, she didn't understand, since the report said that Gaara's change of heart was due to the Uchiha. Koyuki Kazuhana, the daimyo of the recently renamed Spring Country, had also cancelled all trade agreements, including the technology exchange program. The council, who had been salivating at the idea of having the secret of the chakra armor, had been outraged. All envoys had been sent back, only this time they left with a promise of hostile reaction should they try again. Tsunade was no fool and started to doubt the truth of Kakashi's reports when she once again read of the Uchiha's great accomplishments. T Country had followed, as well as several minor villages the Leaf had alliances with. The real shocker, however, was when the Fire Daimyo himself had come to Konoha. He had demanded answers and hadn't been pleased with what he had learned. The military funding of the village had been cut by 40% indefinitely, and half the higher-ranking missions were sent to Suna. She just couldn't see how one kunoichi had such an impact on so many people and in so many places. 3 years ago, when the council had moved for the girl's banishment, she had, at first, fought against it. After all, it was because of Nariko that she had been willing to come back to Konoha. Oh, she held no illusions that she had a real choice. If she had refused to return, the council would have revoked her Sannin travel rights, and she would either have been declared missing nin, or Anbu would have been sent to bring her back by force. But Nariko had reminded her of her late brother and his desire to become Hokage to protect the village he loved. Eventually, however, she had caved in and agreed with the council. She knew that most of the civilians just hated the demon brat and wanted to get rid of her, but some of their concerns were real. First, she had used the Kyuubi's chakra to the point that she defeated a level 2 curse seal. Tsunade knew that her old teammate's creation gave a large power boost, so the kunoichi must have used large quantities of Yuki to bring back the stray Uchiha. His extensive wounds had been more than enough confirmation. The possibility of Kyuubi influencing its vessel was not to be taken lightly. Secondly, Jiraiya had warned her of the Akatsuki and their quest to collect all the Jinchuriki. The Godem had been pained to admit it, but housing the target of a group of S-class criminals was a risk Konoha couldn't take. She planned to have Nariko reinstated when Konoha had recovered from Orochimaru's failed invasion and was better prepared for such a conflict. She had ordered Jiraiya to have his spy network keep an eye on her, but that hadn't worked out the way she hoped. The girl had dropped off the face of the earth, and the only reason they hadn't assumed her to be dead was that her name had still been on the Toad contract. Half a year later, that had no longer been the case. She had signed another contract, though they had no idea which one. Gamabunta had not been pleased. The hardest blow, however, came from her apprentice. Shizune had been rather upset, scratch that she had been royally pissed the fuck off. At first, Tsunade had thought that it would be a temporary thing, since in all their years together the young woman had never stayed angry at her for long. How wrong she had been. 3 years later and Shizune still hadn't forgiven her. They barely spoke anymore, and the younger had abandoned her post as Hokage's assistant in favor of working at the hospital. Just as her depression was starting to set in, Tsunade's senses alerted her to a presence at her office window. Recognizing the chakra's signature, she didn't even turn as she spoke to the new arrival. "What do you want, Jiraiya?" "Suheim, my spy network just informed me that Akatsuki attacked Suna and got Gaara." She turned so fast it was a miracle her head didn't snap off. "When did this happen?" Yesterday, if we move now we can get there in time to help. Maybe we can repair Suna-Konoha relations too. She nodded, saving the case cage would improve relations but something was bothering her. Why didn't they send for help? Jiraiya sighed. He had hoped to avoid the question. From what my informant told me they don't trust Konoha with their case cage's safety, something about not knowing the difference between a demon and a vessel. Tsunade winced at the remark. She pushed the intercom button on her desk. Get Team Kakashi. I have an urgent mission for them. Desert of Suna. A small puff resounded through the silence of the desert of Wind Country as a bottle of cool water was unsealed. Nariko tucked the storage scroll back into her belt as she took a long gulp. Over the last 3.5 years she had grown to a respectable 5 feet 5 inches thanks to a healthy diet and constant training. Her dress code had changed drastically from the orange nightmare she used to wear. She now wore low-cut black pants that clung tightly to her hips but were baggy from mid-thigh down and ended tucked into black combat boots. Her midriff was uncovered, showing off her toned belly and slim waist. A camouflage-style black and red mini t-shirt covered her large C-cup S. Finally, she wore black fingerless gloves with steel knuckles and a black trench coat. With her thin whisker marks, sky-blue eyes and long vibrant blonde hair she cut a very attractive figure. She was now 17 years old and more than happy with how her life had turned out. She smiled fondly as she looked at her partner. She wasn't sure how things would have turned out if she hadn't met him, but she doubted that it would have been good. He hadn't changed much in their time together. He hadn't changed at all, and while he looked to be the same age as her, he was 8 years her senior. She knew why, of course, but it was still an amusing thought. He was dressed similarly to her, black boots and baggy black combat pants, tight sleeveless black and red camouflage t-shirt, black fingerless gloves and a black trench coat with his black katana strapped to his back. Nariko sighed contentedly and took another gulp of water. It was amazing to her how 3 years could make a world of difference. Flashback 3 years ago. Nariko looked down at the seal her newfound Ni-chan had written on her left forearm. It looked like a plain circle, but considering her previous experience with seals she was rather weary of it. So what does this seal do exactly, Naruto Ni-chan? He gave her an evil smirk that put her even more on edge. It's a combination of training seals. It increases the weight on all of your body in a similar fashion to gravity seals, and it increases resistance, making movement harder. When you channel chakra into it, a number will appear in the circle. Each time you channel chakra into it, the number will increase, showing what level you're at. Nariko pushed a little chakra into the seal and watched as it glowed and a number, 1, appeared inside the circle. As expected, she felt an increase in weight and it became harder to move. It was as if the air had become a bit thicker, or like moving underwater. Still, while it was noticeable, she had expected a bigger difference. Level 1 isn't too bad, should I go straight to level 2? She asked. Naruto shook his head. No, I want you to get used to level 1 first. You'll probably ask me at some point, so I'll explain right now. When I train, I always take the time to master a stage before I move on to the next one. For your physical training, that means increasing the weights a little at a time and making sure you can perform perfectly before you increase them again. There's no point in getting faster and stronger if your form becomes sloppy, is there? You'll find it annoying at first, having to rework all your katas each time you move up a level, but you'll get used to it and I promise the results will be worth it. She seemed to accept what he said, which came as a relief since most ninjas wanted results as soon as possible. He also knew that her trust came, in part, from the fact that someone was finally taking an interest in her training. So what are you going to teach me? Let's see, when you used Cage Bunshin there was a lot of wasted chakra, so we'll have to work on your control. Your taijutsu is, well, let's just say it needs a lot of work. You don't have a sword, so I suppose you don't know any kenjutsu. I'll teach you that from scratch. I'll also teach you fuinjutsu. There are loads of things I can teach you that aren't shinobi skills but are still very useful. So yeah, I've got loads to teach you. In a couple of years you'll be stronger than most Junin. When you get to that level we'll start taking missions so you can get some experience. Nariko frowned. How am I going to learn all that in just 2 years? I mean, if it was that easy everyone would be super strong. Naruto smiled softly. First, the fact that you aren't dead despite basically receiving no training whatsoever shows that you have a lot of potential. Second, you have me as your sensei. And third, we're going to make use of the insane amount of cage bunchins we can make. The frown on Nariko's face was becoming a permanent fix. How will cage bunchin help in training? Naruto's jaw dropped. How did she not notice the number of bunchins she can make? I guess she only uses them in battle situations. In that case, she wouldn't have time to process the memory feedback. Well, you see, originally Cage Bunchin no Jutsu was an Uzumaki technique. The Uzumaki clan was kind of famous for having very large chakra reserves, but as a result, they had rather bad control. One of the smarter clan members created a clone that could work on chakra control for him. That's the Cage Bunchin. Anything the clone learns will go back to the original through memory feedback. For most shinobi, the jutsu is too costly, but for an Uzumaki, it's the best training method there is. Nariko's enthusiasm started boiling up as she realized the possibilities. She jumped to her feet and pumped her fist in the air. This is great. I'll be able to train in everything. I'll be kicking shinobi butt in no time. Hey, calm down. Even with Cage Bunchin, we're still going to take it bit by bit. For the first month, we'll have 2 groups of bunchins. The first will work on basic chakra control exercises. Tree walking, water walking, leaf balancing, and kunai balancing. The second group will work on taijutsu. I don't use a single style because with Cage Bunchin I can master a style just through muscle memory. We'll do the same for you, first with the basic style, then the more elaborate ones. While your clones are doing their thing, I'll supervise your physical training. This is the only thing Cage Bunchin can't help you with. You'll start every morning at sunrise by doing sit-ups, push-ups, pull-ups, squats and jumping jacks. Then we'll spar until lunchtime. It'll be hard at first, but this way you'll learn to save your energy. After lunch, we'll travel for a few hours and spar again. When we're done, we'll set up camp and turn in for the night. Quote, end flashback. That first month had gone well. Nariko took to taijutsu like a fish to water. She absorbed the different styles at an incredible rate and could switch from one to another in the blink of an eye. As he had predicted, their spars were short to begin with. While he never went all out, he didn't go easy on her either. He would fight at a level that would make for a long fight in which she never had a moment's rest. After the first week or so, she was learning to move efficiently and to wait for the right moment to attack rather than just charging in. From then on, the spars became longer and harder every day. Her chakra control group made good progress, but she still had a ways to go since Kyuubi's presence made her chakra reserves even larger than her Uzumaki bloodline. When the month was over, Naruto was more than satisfied with her progress and ready to move on to the next stage. By then they had crossed to the very north of the elemental countries. Flashback. They were currently standing on a large flat platform carved right out off the side of a mountain. It looked as if someone had tried to chop the top off only to stop halfway through, leaving a smooth horizontal floor and equally smooth vertical wall. The platform itself cut about 500 feet into the mountain and was roughly twice as long. Nariko wasn't sure how high up they were, and she didn't want to think about it. She watched her brother as he placed his hand on a seemingly random part of the wall. There was a faint glow and a door-sized rectangular hole opened soundlessly. Naruto walked in without a word. She had come to expect that of her Ni-chan. He would always explain things in detail and would be happy to answer any question she asked. But when no words were needed, no words were spoken. After being alone for the best part of 13 years, it wasn't all that surprising. Following him, she found herself in a long tunnel with the same dimensions as the entrance, which had closed after she passed through it. The walls and ceiling gave a soft blue glow, allowing her to see where she was going. After 20 feet, she stepped out of the tunnel and felt her jaw drop. If she hadn't known better, she would have thought she just stepped into a daimyo's garden. They were standing at the edge of a large circular cave. It was 500 feet across and 100 high. Despite being inside a mountain, there was soft grass growing on the floor. To her left, there were a variety of fruit trees and bushes. A small river ran from one side to the other about halfway in, with a little wooden bridge crossing it. To the right, the river ended in a crystal-clear pond with exotic fish swimming around. On the other side of the river, there was a small one-story traditional-style house and a sakura tree. Okay, how in the name of Kami-sama did you get a sakura tree in here? Nariko asked incredulously. Naruto looked at her with a raised eyebrow. I put in a storage seal. He replied dryly. Nariko blinked, blushed and looked down in embarrassment. The answer was quite obvious really. Naruto gestured and they started walking towards the house. This is easily my greatest non-combat related achievement. I have 5 other safe houses exactly like this one throughout the elemental nations. The only thing that changes is the location. The others are all underground rather than hidden in a mountain. They're also much closer to civilization. Being the most isolated, this one is by far the best for training. Everything is powered by seals, the artificial sunlight, the temperature, the river's flow. I even have a hot spring on the other side of the house. There are also seals to keep the water and air pure. The entire cave is surrounded by security seals with a blood seal at the entrance, so even if we are attacked here we'll have plenty of time to react. There are 3 emergency exits by the way. He turned to see his sister gasping like a fish out of water and grinned in satisfaction. I know, it's great, isn't it? I never thought I'd trust anyone enough to share it. He ended in a melancholy tone that pulled Nariko from her stupor. She walked up and wrapped her arms around him tightly, burying her face in his chest. It's beautiful, Oni-chan, she mumbled. It's perfect. Naruto grinned and slid an arm around her back and the other under her legs. He picked her up bridal style, causing her to eep, and carried her across the bridge and into the house. End flashback. They had spent the next week relaxing after their long journey, swimming in the pond, sitting under the sakura tree, or bathing in the hot springs. The safe house hadn't been built with privacy in mind since Naruto hadn't intended to have company of any kind. But they had developed a close relationship and weren't bothered by the proximity they had to share. Flashback. They were now on the training area outside the mountain safe house, or as Nariko called it, the Ledge of Doom. As you've noticed, this training ground has a potentially dangerous particularity. Being a freakishly smooth surface at a rather high altitude, there are often gusts of wind that vary from a gentle breeze to a freezing gale. I didn't plan that when I was cutting the rock, but I decided to leave it as it is. This will force you to always be on guard. At any moment a powerful wind could blow through and you'll have to use chakra to stick to the floor. Believe me, you don't even want to think of falling from this height. Now, I want you to take this and channel some chakra into it. Taking the small piece of paper, she did as she was told and pushed chakra into it. To her surprise, it split in half vertically. Then after a moment the left half burst into flames and the right half crumbled to dust. She dropped the paper so as not to get burnt and leveled a mild glare at her brother. Ignoring her displeasure, Naruto nodded at the results. That was chakra paper used to test elemental affinities. In your case, you have a primary affinity for wind. That was the paper splitting in 2. Then you have strong affinities in fire and earth. Those were respectively indicated by the flames and the dust. I take it that's a good thing? She asked, observing his satisfied expression a little warily. Naruto just shrugged. It's neither good nor bad really, it's not the elements that matter but what you do with them. Anyway, down to business. From now on the training schedule will be a bit different. Most noticeable is that we no longer have to travel, so we'll be training in the afternoons as well. Nariko let out a groan upon hearing that. She was glad to have a dedicated sensei, but her Ni-chan was a merciless slave driver. It was a testament to his demanding nature that the most relaxing moments over the last month were their daily runs to cross-elemental nations. The thought of being pushed to the limit all day long was daunting, to say the least. She steeled her resolve and rekindled her determination. She was Uzumaki Nariko by Kami. Nothing would make her give up. Seeing his sister getting psyched up, Naruto grinned widely and explained the training plan. Your mornings will start the same, up at sunrise to do your warm-ups. Then we'll spar until lunch as usual. During that time I want you to a group of Kage Bunshin working on advanced chakra control. Another group will work on mastering one of your elements, I'll let you choose which. Finally, I want a group working on Fuinjutsu. I'll let you choose how many clones to have per group, just make sure you don't slack off. Any questions so far? Why am I only working on one element? Can't I just use clones to work on all of 3? She asked with a cute pout. She may have calmed down over the last month, but the prospect of throwing all kinds of jutsu around was just too tempting. Naruto answered with a chuckle. You could, but in the long term, this way will yield better results. By training 3 elements at the same time, you're more likely to miss something. A little detail can make the difference between good and perfect. Seeing her nod in understanding, he continued. After lunch, the training will be much more theoretical. We'll both make groups of clones and mine will tutor yours in all sorts of skills and knowledge, from engineering to first aid to cooking." Nariko raised an eyebrow. She could understand engineering since might help if she had to destroy a bridge or something. First aid was a given, not everyone has a Kyuubi enhanced healing factor. "But, why the hell do I have to learn about cooking?" she half yelled. "Have you ever eaten a ration bar?" He replied in with a deadpan voice and a slight shiver of disgust. Her eyes widened and she nodded her head vigorously. Those things were vile. She made a silent oath to pay extra attention to the cooking lessons. "I'm not sure how long it will take for you to learn everything, but when you will be able to use the afternoons for elemental and fuinjutsu training. In the evenings we'll cover genjutsu, kenjutsu and other things, but the pace will be slower so we can cool off before bedtime." He finished with a large smile. It took everything she had to not pummel him for using such a jovial tone to describe her torture training. Instead, she just heaved a weary sigh. It's going to be a long couple of years. End flashback. From that point on, time seemed to lose most of its meaning. The repetitive training made each day blurred into the next. Nariko's only solace was that they took Sundays off. The old Nariko, the one who tried everything to gain people's attention, would have disregarded her sensei's words and trained all her elements at the same time. Having a teacher who explained why he wanted her to do something rather than just telling her to do it made a lot of difference. She had decided to start with wind manipulation since she shared the element with her Oni-chan. It took her just under a week to cut a leaf in half. Naruto had been well prepared and had collected, and sealed, thousands of leaves during their month-long journey. She had expected to start learning all sorts of cool jutsu. Flashback. "So Oni-chan, what cool jutsu are you going to teach me? Some cool futon jutsu?" Nariko asked as she bounced on her heels in anticipation. "No," he answered simply, stopping her in mid-bounds. "What? Why not?" she asked incredulously. With a sigh, Naruto replied. "Normally from here, the next exercise would be to cut a waterfall using wind chakra. As always, however, I've come up with a better way to do things. The waterfall exercise is the same as the leaf exercise. The only difference is that you have to convert and pump out a lot more chakra." Nariko's face scrunched up as she concentrated, trying to see where this was going. The main thing she had come to realize was that where many would say, better quality than quantity, Naruto would say, better quality and quantity. That was it. "So rather than move on to making more wind chakra, you want me to learn to control what I can make first," she said, causing him to give her a proud smile. "Exactly. Start by taking a leaf, but instead of cutting it in half, I want you to cut a swirl in it. When you've got that down, choose another pattern, and so on until you think you can cut anything you want into it. When you've got that down, you can move on to the waterfall exercise." She nodded and created a batch of 50 clones and unsealed a scroll of leaves. She was growing to hate these things. End flashback. At first, she had been a little upset about not learning any jutsu. However, when she moved on to cutting shapes in a waterfall a few miles away from the safe house, she realized the great advantage of what Naruto had taken to calling the Uzumaki training style. For the average shinobi, those who use the standard training method, hand signs made up for the lack of control over the element. With her ever-increasing skill in manipulating wind, she could shape it without hand signs. She couldn't yet do anything too complicated, but she now had the incentive needed to push through the repetitive exercises. It took 6 months of Kage Bunshin to fine-tune futon manipulation. When she had completed training her wind element, she decided to move on to the next. However, when she told Naruto, she got an unexpected response. Flashback. They had just finished their morning warm-ups. Naruto does them too, so he stays in top shape. Before creating the morning work groups, Nariko drew her brother's attention. "Oni-chan, I'm ready to move on to fire manipulation now." He just nodded. He had seen her progress and knew that she was ready. She could still make some improvements, but that was to be expected. "Okay, I'll get you started on that, but I'll also want you to study the contents of this scroll." He handed her a medium-sized scroll with the kanji for wind on it. Unrolling the scroll, she found that it was covered in storage seals with names of wind jutsu under them. She saw names like Futon, Daitapa, Futon, Rikuden, and Futon, Kase no Yeba, written on it. She looked at him with raised brows. "What's this for? I mean, I can probably do all of these through wind manipulation, so why bother learning them?" she asked. Because others will use them if you can recognize the sequence of hand seals your opponent is making, you'll know what jutsu he or she is going to use before he or she does it. She nodded in understanding. Right, now let's move on to fire manipulation. There are 2 ways to start. The first is to take a leaf in your hand and set it on fire. The second is to charge fire chakra into your lungs and breathe it out. When you've got that down, I want you to try and work out the next step yourself. I'll help if need be, but it's best if you create your advanced manipulation exercises. Like I said before, the problem with most shinobi is that they're too lazy to work things out themselves. End flashback. Mastering Kaden manipulation took longer than Futon. Having to figure it out for herself made it harder, but she got there in the end. The first part that she got down was changing the chakra in her lungs into Kaden chakra and exhaling a ball of fire. She guessed that it was because the air contained in her lungs was easier to ignite than the air around her hands. To practice her control, she would compress the fire into smaller and smaller balls, making them incredibly hot. Once she was able to set a leaf on fire with her fingers, she found that lung fire was generally hotter and finger fire was easier to shape. She eventually developed a system where she would shape the fire with her fingers and then breathe more heat into it. Once her second element was on par with her first, she moved on to earth. Flashback. Okay, Natsu-chan Doden manipulation will be like Kaden in that I won't be able to help you beyond the basic exercises. He took out a scroll and unsealed the contents. When the smoke cleared, she could see a huge pile of pebbles. Rather than asking, she just waited for an explanation. In books, you'll read that the exercise is to turn the pebbles to dust. What you want to do is use your chakra to change their density. That includes turning them to dust, but also the opposite, making them harder. He brought his hand to his chin in a thinking pose and then shook his head. That's all. You'll have to work out the rest yourself. By the way, we've been here for just over 13 months. At the end of the second year, we'll be leaving to get some fighting experience. We'll still be training, but I want you to get earth manipulation down before then. I've also got something else to teach you in regards to elemental chakra, so the faster you finish the better. End flashback. Nariko's series of flashbacks were interrupted as her brother gave her arm 2 short taps. She looked at him questioningly. Naruto handed her a pair of binoculars and pointed to their left. She brought them to her eyes and scanned the horizon for what had caught his attention. That was pretty easy, yeah, said Deidara enthusiastically. No one can stand against my art, yeah. Sasori gave no reply as they made their way across the desert. They had just captured the Ichibi Jinchuriki and were headed towards the cave that had been prepared for the Biju's extraction. Flying a dozen feet above the ground, Deidara's clay bird was carrying an unconscious Sabaku no Gara. The young Case Cage had fought valiantly and had been winning, but in the end, he had sacrificed his victory to protect his village from the ex-Iwa Nin's bombs. The Akatsuki and their prisoner were now approaching the border with river country. A blur of movement made them stop as a pair of ninja in black trench coats landed in front of them. The 2 duos observed each other in silence. The S-class artists weren't worried. After all, relatively few shinobi were a threat against them, and even less would attack them since they were wearing the distinctive Akatsuki cloaks. These 2 were probably upstart missing nin trying to make a name for themselves. The Uzumakis launched into action, surprising their opponents who were expecting boastful introductions and speeches. Nariko thrust her hands forwards and a wave of large sand shot forwards. Deidara dodged to the left and Sasori to the right. The wave of sand passed between them and curved up towards the clay bird. It dived down, barely escaping the attack as it scraped over its back. Gaara was somehow unharmed, but neither had time to question the occurrence. Naruto slammed a fist into his foe and a metallic clang confirmed his suspicions. He and Nariko had observed the Akatsuki members for a while before attacking. Deidara of the Rock had been easy enough to identify from his description in the bingo book, but the other had taken a while. It was only when they caught a glimpse of the wooden tail that they guessed they were looking at a puppet and that it was most likely controlled by Sasori of the Red Sands. He pushed off and flipped backwards to a safe distance as the tail tried to pierce his chest. He reached up and grabbed the hilt of his katana, drawing its black blade from the sheath. Deidara ducked a punch from Nariko but couldn't dodge the knee that was sent at his face. He flipped over as he flew back and landed on his feet. Nariko charged forwards and threw a combination of punches and kicks with roughly half hitting their mark. Realizing he was outmatched in taijutsu, the missing nin sprung backwards and his hand-mouths each spat out a clay dragonfly that headed straight for the blonde. Naruto pumped wind chakra into his blade as Sasori's tail took a swipe at him. He kicked off the ground so his body was parallel to the desert floor. As the wooden appendage passed under him, he spun on a horizontal axis. His blade passed through the wood and metal of the puppet like a knife through butter. As soon as he touched down, Naruto twisted clockwise on his right foot and sliced in an upwards diagonal motion, releasing a crescent-shaped blade of wind that cut through the side of the tank, causing it to blow apart in a burst of smoke. Nariko rolled to the side to avoid the clay dragonflies just before they exploded. She pushed forwards and blew a wide ball of fire to intercept the incoming swarm of explosive insects. She ran through the dust cloud and drop-kicked Deidara, sending him flying back towards their starting spot with a satisfying crack as at least 2 ribs broke. Planting a hand on the ground, she spun her legs in a helicopter motion and twisted her waist, ending up on her feet facing her opponent as he struggled to stand. Naruto stared in fascination at the wooden man that emerged from the smoke. To take the art of puppetry to such a level was amazing. Sasori unrolled a scroll and a puff of smoke erupted when it cleared a force of 100 human puppets. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Nariko with her back to him as she waited for Deidara to get to his feet. He smirked and pumped chakra into a kunai before throwing it at her and using shushin. A few hundred yards away, 2 cage bunshin dispelled themselves. Nariko felt her clone dispel and received the flow of information from Naruto's fight. She grinned and took a deep breath as she dashed at Deidara. When she felt her brother's kunai closing in on her head, she jumped high into the air and flipped back so she was upside down with Sasori beneath her. Seeing his new opponent, the puppet user had his wooden army send a veritable forest of arms, each equipped with a poison-coated blade. Nariko exhaled a stream of very hot humid air that bathed the attackers in a haze that would put any tropical climate to shame. The unorthodox technique destroyed the poison and damaged the puppets' joints, reducing their speed and agility. Nariko weaved through the severely weakened wood soldiers, destroying them as she made a beeline for their master. Deidara's eyes trailed Nariko in confusion as she jumped away, seemingly abandoning the fight. Suddenly his danger senses went haywire as he heard the low whistle of a kunai. He only just twisted his torso in time to avoid the weapon impaling his heart. He winced as it cut his right bicep. Deidara's eyes widened in horror at the amount of blood that came from the wound, even more so when instead of falling on the sandy floor it rose to a good 10-20 feet above the ground and formed a large blood-red storm cloud. What the hell? Naruto's shushined a short distance from the bomb user just as the blood cloud started to take form. His opponent's shocked exclamation brought a smirk to Naruto's face, but rather than gloat he channeled more chakra into his jutsu and molded it to his will. There was a low thunderous rumble as parts of the red cloud darkened. He let out a small sigh as Deidara remained transfixed by the miniature chakra-generated storm. This always happened. He had created it with the awe factor in mind. It drew the enemy's attention and then a crack resounded and a jagged beam of black lightning arced from the cloud and struck straight through Deidara's heart. Deidara didn't even blink, his face held in an expression of amazement as he keeled over and fell to the ground. Dead. Nariko slammed her fist into her opponent's wooden body but only scored a passing blow as he dodged to the side. She spun on her heel to deliver a roundhouse kick to his chest but had to jump back as he slashed at her with a blade that emerged from his forearm. Nariko ducked and swerved the blows from the remaining puppets as she tried to work out a way to kill a wooden man. Suddenly the clay bird dropped to the ground between them, bringing the fight to a halt. Nariko and Sasori looked to their left to see Naruto walking towards them and a dead Deidara behind him. Before they could react, Sasori grabbed the still unconscious Gaara and held his blade arm to his throat. "Stay where you are or I'll kill him," he spoke in a low monotone. "What makes you think we care?" Naruto asked calmly. They did care, of course, but as he doubted that it might make things easier. "I don't know who you are, but I recognize Uzumaki Nariko. Unless she wants fellow Jinchuriki's head cut off, you'll stay where you are," he answered, and he started backing away. Naruto made to go after him but Nariko held him back. "Naruto-kun, don't," she pleaded. As Sasori was out of striking distance he turned and ran, carrying his charge on his shoulder and never noticing the smirks on Naruto and Nariko's faces. They waited for a minute and Naruto turned to his sister. I think that's long enough, don't you? She nodded and brought her hands up in a ram seal. Bunshin Deibakuha. A quarter-mile away, a Yuki-charged cage Bunshin, hanged to look like the Ichibi Jinchuriki, exploded, disintegrating everything in a 30-foot radius. Nariko smiled widely as the clone's memories came back to her. Well, that wasn't too hard, she exclaimed. We had a good plan and didn't give them time to react. Now let's go see your friend. They started running towards Suna and quickly caught up with the group of 4 clones, 2 each, that were carrying the still unconscious Gaara. Dispelling the clones, Naruto did a quick check to see if anything was wrong and found a small paper tag on the back of his neck. There's nothing too serious, but they put a suppressor seal on his neck. It blocks the Ichibi's Yukai and stops it from healing him. Once I take it off, he should be back to normal in no time. He pushed some chakra into the seal and deactivated it. He could just rip the tag off, but it was always best to be careful with Fuinjutsu. Naruto slung the young Kei's cage over his shoulder and they headed off across the desert at full speed. The sun was just setting on Sanagakure no Sato and Sabaku no Tamari was briefing a group of the best Junin in Suna for the Gaara rescue mission. There had been talk of asking for help from Konoha, but the idea was shot down when one of the shinobi said that considering how they treated their Jinchuriki, it might be putting Gaara in danger from his rescuers as well. With the increase in missions, it had taken almost 2 days for the team to be assembled since many Junin were outside the village. They would have to make haste to catch the cage nappers. Suddenly a Chunin appeared next to her. Tamari-sama, 2 shinobi in black have been spotted heading towards the village gates at high speed. They'll be here in a matter of minutes. Tamari turned and ran towards the village entrance. She hoped that it wasn't Akatsuki again. If it was, they wouldn't be able to go after her brother. She tensed when the people they were waiting for came to a stop a short distance from her. They looked like they were in their late teens and, other than the red on their red t-shirts, were dressed all in black. She didn't think they were Akatsuki, but that didn't mean they were allies, an opinion shared by the rest of her group if the drawing of Kanai was anything to go by. Wow, we're not looking for a fight, Naruto said as he took a few steps forwards and placed Gaara on the ground before stepping back. Gaara. Tamari ran up to her brother. What's wrong with him? She asked with a small glare. He's just unconscious, Nariko answered in a placating manner. Those Akatsuki guys put a seal on him to stop his demon from healing him. Naruto-kun took it off, so he should wake up soon. Tamari blinked as she recognized the kunoichi that defeated her brother at the Chunin exams and her eyes widened. She had grown quite a bit and wasn't wearing the orange nightmare, so she looked quite different. If it wasn't for the whisker marks on her cheeks, she would have thought it was someone else, and even those were thinner than she remembered. Nariko-san? Nariko grinned and gave a cheeky wave. Scrambling to her feet, Tamari bowed deeply. Arigato. For bringing my Otuto back. She motioned for them to follow her as Gaara was carried into the village. But how did you know we had been attacked by Akatsuki? Nariko chuckled and rubbed the back of her head. We didn't. We were crossing the desert and kind of bumped into them, she confessed, causing Tamari to sweat drop. The Suna kunoichi's eyes then strayed over to Naruto. Who are you? She asked bluntly. He arched an eyebrow. Uzumaki Naruto, he replied, Nariko's partner. Tamari nodded and they walked in silence to the hospital where Gaara was placed in a bed to recover as doctors started running diagnostic jutsu over him. Nariko looked at the person occupying the next bed. Hey, is that Makeup Boy? She asked incredulously, pointing at a clean-faced Kankuro. Yeah, that's him, laughed Tamari. He looks like he's been poisoned, Naruto said as he observed the young man's feverish form. Tamari sighed. He is. He was poisoned by Sasori's puppet. There's nothing the med nin can do. Her answer caused Naruto to frown. He knew quite a few healing jutsu, but he wasn't an expert, since neither he nor Nariko had to worry about poison. Sasori was renowned for his skill with poison, so there would be no easy antidote. But, do you have a sample of his blood? I mean a non-infected sample, Naruto asked. A small glint of hope appeared in Temari's eyes and she quickly told one of the nurses to get the blood sample. When the nurse came back, Naruto took the blood pack and filled a syringe. He paused and thought. He had never tried something like this, so he was trying to anticipate how it would work out. Coming to a plausible scenario, he created a cage bunshin and pumped more chakra into it. The reinforced clone took the syringe and channeled chakra into it before emptying it in midair. The observers were surprised when, instead of falling to the floor, the blood sample hung like a small cloud. Clone Naruto then moved towards Kankuro and directed the blood to his bare chest. They watched transfixed as it sunk into him and disappeared from view. One of the med nin turned to Naruto, looking alternately between him and his doppelganger. "What kind of med jutsu is that?" she asked eagerly. Nariko snorted. Naruto sent her a mild glare before answering. "It's not. It's an assassination jutsu." "What?" Temari screamed and ran to try and save her brother, although how she intended to do so was a mystery. She was stopped by Nariko's hand on her shoulder. "Wait, let him explain first." She turned to her brother and stared him in the eye. "You had better explain or else." She trailed off, leaving him to guess the end of her threat. Naruto paled considerably. While what she was implying would be a punishment for her as much as it would be for him, he knew just how stubborn she could be. Okay, I'll explain," he said hastily. "The blood cloud is an original jutsu that works by taking a blood sample and using chakra to copy the blood's signature. Everybody's blood is different. By using that difference I can target my enemies for assassination. Are you following so far?" At the collective nod and knuckle cracking from Temari, he pursued his explanation. "When I have my target I can attack in two ways: identification and discrimination. Identification works by locking on to the target and striking at it, avoiding everything else. Discrimination works by locking on to the target but striking at everything else, avoiding it. In Makeup Boy's case, the target is his blood and I'm attacking by discrimination, so it will strike at everything else and most importantly Sasori's poison. I guess you could say I'm assassinating the poison." There was silence as they absorbed his words. "Why is the clone doing it? Why not do it yourself?" the med nin asked. "As I said, it's not a healing jutsu. I can only destroy the poison in his bloodstream. I have to wait for the poison that's passed into other areas to cycle back to be destroyed, and I don't feel like staying here all night, hence the clone." Naruto replied with a shrug. His lips twitched in a hint of a grin. "Speaking of all night, I'm whacked. Is there a good hotel we can stay?" Temari directed them to the best hotel in the village, saying that all expenses would be covered and apologizing for not accompanying them. She wanted to stay at her brother's sides. "Okay, the bridge was one thing, but this is just too much," Naruto said, his voice full of laughter as he looked up at the 10-foot stone statue of a 12-year-old Nariko. They had just arrived in Wave Country and were headed towards Tazuna's house. Naruto had had a good laugh when he saw the Great Nariko Bridge, something she had failed to mention when she told him about her life. He had openly admitted that he was proud of her and that the bridge just proved how great she was. As well as how stupid the people of Konoha were to have treated her like they did. He was glad that the people of Wave recognized and acknowledged his Imouto's accomplishment and very thankful that someone other than him had shown her true kindness. The giant statue, however, was just, as he said, too much. "Shut up, Naruto-kun. You just can't appreciate art," she chastised, trying to ignore how true his words rang. She was honored that they would build a monument for her. 3 years ago, having a 10-foot statue of her striking a nice guy pose in the middle of a town square would have ranked right up with being named Hokage or getting a year's supply of free ramen. But she had calmed down since then and, although she wouldn't admit it, it was a bit over the top. "Oh, it's a work of art all right," Naruto said as he clutched his stomach in laughter. "I'm just glad they didn't paint the thing. Can you imagine the 10-foot orange nightmare?" His face looked like it was going to split. He was grinning so wide, that would light up the town. With a nasty scowl on her pretty face, Nariko stormed off towards Tazuna's house, a laughing Naruto in tow. She thought of giving him the no threat, but considering how that always ended, she didn't think it a good idea. Tsunami probably wouldn't appreciate her house being flooded. She blushed as she remembered the state their hotel room back in Suna had been in when they had finished. While being able to come for hours on end without getting dehydrated had its perks, it did tend to create a bit of a mess. Back in Konoha, a disgruntled Team 7 was giving their report on their mission, or rather the lack of mission. "So let me get this straight," said a flustered Tsunade, "you got to Suna and not only were you denied entrance, but someone had already saved the case cage." Sakura and Kakashi nodded and Sasuke gave his usual HN. The last Senju sighed as she poured herself a cup of sake. "So who saved him? I didn't think Suna has any shinobi capable of taking on Akatsuki." Sasuke growled at the thought of a mere Suna nin having more power than him. I don't know Tsunade-sama, Kakashi said. Her eyes narrowed. What do you mean you don't know? Why didn't you ask? I did ask, but they refused to answer. I asked to meet with the Kage, but they said that he was still recovering from his ordeal and didn't have time for foreign ninja. The copy nin replied. Tsunade sighed. She had been counting on their saving Gaara to repair the Konohasuna relationship. Then she thought of another detail Jiraiya's spy network picked up. What about Kankuro-san? Jiraiya said he was poisoned by Sasori. Surely they asked for Sakura's help? The previous conversation made it obvious that they hadn't, but she was getting desperate for some good news. This time it was Sakura who answered. Apparently whoever helped Gaara also took care of that. She said bitterly, angry at not getting a chance to impress her Sasuke-kun. Tsunade felt her teammate's chakra at the outside office, so she dismissed Team 7 with a wave of her hand. When they were gone, she turned to the window and waited for him to drop his cloaking jutsu. So, she said, hoping to get some good news, do you know who this mysterious savior is? Jiraiya nodded once, waiting for her to down her cup of sake since he knew this wouldn't go over well. Yeah, it turns out Gaara was saved by Uzumaki Noriko and an accomplice. Tsunade choked, spraying sake across her desk and ruining what little paperwork she had completed. As he was sent flying across Konoha by Tsunade's chakra-enhanced fist, Jiraiya couldn't help but chuckle at the result of the blonde Kage's latest gamble. Legendary sucker indeed. Achoo. Naruto looked at his partner with a raised eyebrow. Looks like someone's talking about you. He said, yeah, it's probably someone in Konoha that found out about us. Naruto nodded in agreement. Konoha was bound to find out sooner or later. Saving a Kage from S-class criminals doesn't stay secret for long. The leaf would probably come after them now that they had resurfaced, either to convince Noriko to come back or to remove her so she can't become a threat. Either way, they weren't worried. They had gone to Tazuna's house but there was nobody there. Guessing that they were at work or out shopping, Noriko had decided to visit Zabuza and Haku's graves. As they reached the tree line where the Kiri missing nin and his accomplice were laid to rest, they noticed that the area had been well maintained and some flowers had been planted. Naruto raised an eyebrow at the sight. It wasn't much of a grave, though it was more than most shinobi ever got. A line of small stones marked where the bodies had been buried. A zanbato stabbed into the ground on the left and a lopsided cross, made from what looked like two pieces of castaway construction wood, on the right. No, it wasn't much of a grave, but it held a certain peace and tranquility. It was like a watered-down version of what he felt when he looked into Noriko's eyes. Wordlessly Naruto stepped behind his Imouto and slipped his arms around her waist. Noriko leaned into the hug and they stood there silently, in contemplation, with no regard for the passing time. Eventually, Noriko spoke up, breaking the comfortable silence. Naruto-kun, what are we going to do? I mean, one can't just wander around aimlessly forever. She asked softly. He answered her, knowing exactly what she meant. I've thought about it. When I was alone I didn't have any plans. I just traveled and worked on developing new skills. During our time in the mountains, I would often ask myself what we would do when your training was finished. He paused, whether it was for effect or in hesitation she wasn't sure. His next question however shocked her. Do you still want to be a Kage? Noriko spun around, though his arms still held her tightly to him as she stared him in the eyes with a quizzical gaze. But you hate the villages. Well, you don't hate them but you certainly don't like them. And I'm sure as hell not going back to Konoha. Naruto smirked at her. I never said we would join a village. He said. Noriko frowned in confusion, then her eyes widened in understanding. You want to build a village? Her eyes widened even more as she realized what he truly meant. You want to rebuild Uzugakure. It wasn't a question, they knew each other well enough that she knew that's what he meant. Naruto watched the expressions play on her face as she mulled the idea over, the surprise, skepticism, hope, eagerness. He could tell that she liked the idea, but what's to stop it from becoming like all the other villages? She asked. Naruto smiled indulgently as if she was asking a silly question, but he was willing to answer anyway. We are, he answered simply. There was a short, awkward silence. That's a cheesy answer, she replied. Yeah. He rubbed the back of his head and a light blush colored his cheeks. Well, think about it. For now, we'll talk tomorrow and put a plan together. They strolled back leisurely back to the house, enjoying the afternoon breeze as the heat of the day started to lift. They admired the view as they walked. It was about an hour to sunset and light was reflecting off the ocean water in a beautiful and hypnotic display. The moment was broken by the sound of breaking glass and an angry cry. They were instantly on guard and moved towards the house. Nariko slides the door open, staying out of the opening in case someone was waiting to attack her. Naruto stayed back and covered her, kunai drawn and ready for action. When they saw that nobody was in the entrance room, they swiftly but silently made their way inside. They headed towards the kitchen to investigate the source of the disturbance. Tazuna and Inari were not having a good day. The family had decided to go down to the shore for the day to have some fun. They had had a picnic lunch and everything had been going fine. After lunch, Tazuna and Inari had rolled up their pant legs and waded into the water to try and catch some fish. The keyword being, try. Tazuna was an engineer, not a fisherman, and Inari was just a kid apprenticing under an engineer. They could have sworn the fish were laughing at them. The aquatic fun had come to an end when a scream from Tsunami tore through the usual afternoon buzz. They spun around and saw that she was surrounded by a rough dozen men, bandits by the looks of things. Without thinking, Tazuna ran towards the shore to help his daughter. As bad luck would have it, however, his foot hit a rock, he tripped, fell and knocked himself out when his head hit the ground. Inari had to drag his grandfather to dry land to prevent him from drowning. By the time Tazuna gained consciousness, the bandits had left with their new captive. They searched for a good hour, desperate to save their female family member, but they had no luck and eventually, Tazuna's concussion forced them to return home. When they got back, Inari started gathering anything that could, even remotely, serve as a weapon or shield. 3 years ago he had promised his Oni-chan that he would never give up, and that was a promise that he intended to keep. Tazuna went straight for a bottle of sake. After the Battle of the Bridge, as people called it, he had given in to his daughter's pleas and stopped drinking. Well, he had stopped drowning himself in alcohol. He had cut down to a few cups after the evening meal. He took a large mouthful of the beverage, but as soon as the taste hit his tongue he spat it out. Drinking wouldn't help his situation at all. The Gato incident had proven that. In his frustration, he threw the bottle at the kitchen window and let loose an inarticulate cry of anger. Moments later, a teenage girl stepped into the kitchen and scanned it once as if checking for threats. When she found none, she relaxed and sighed in relief. Then another teen stepped in, a boy this time and slightly older by the looks of things. He too looked around quickly, and then relaxed with an expression of curiosity on his face. Nariko looked around the kitchen trying to locate any possible threat. She saw that Tazuna seemed to have been in a fight and had a nasty head wound. Inari had a pot on his head, a collection of kitchen knives stabbed through a tea towel tied to his waist, a rather large meat cleaver in his right hand and a rolling pin in his left. She sweat dropped. What are you guys doing?" she asked, sounding as if she doubted she wanted to know what kind of weirdness they were up to. There was a moment's silence, then Inari's eyes grew wide as dinner plates. "Nariko ne-chan," he screamed and launched himself at her. Naruto could tell the issue was something more than a rebellious bottle of sake, so as his Imouto tried to calm the boy down, he walked up to Tazuna. "Hello, you're Tazuna-san, I presume?" he asked, getting a nod. "Okay. I'm Natsu-chan's partner. Can you tell me what's going on here?" Having dealt with ninja on more than one occasion, Tazuna quickly and precisely explained the situation, from the picnic to Tsunami's kidnapping to their fruitless search. Glad for the concise but detailed report, Naruto immediately went into action. "Nariko-chan, you take care of Tazuna-san's wound, I'll go after Tsunami-san. The sun hasn't set yet, so the bandits probably haven't set up camp for the night. Hopefully, I can catch them before they're done." Nariko nodded her head once. Taking out a group of bandits, no matter how large, wouldn't require both their attention. They could probably send a clone to do it. What Naruto had avoided saying in front of Tazuna and Inari was what would happen if he got there after the bandits finished setting up their camp. Simply put, Tsunami's dignity would probably be safe until then. They might rough her up a bit if she put up too much resistance, but not much more than that. If they finished setting up camp before Naruto found them, the likelihood of her being raped increased by the minute. And depending on how many men were in the group, he may already be too late. Looking around the kitchen once more, Naruto spotted an apron and, grabbing hold of it, he turned to Tazuna. "Is this your daughter's?" he asked. "Yes. The old man answered. Then apparently guessing why the young shinobi asked, he added, "She wears it whenever she's cooking." Naruto nodded in thanks. "The scent will be strong then. It'll make finding her easier." Nariko watched nervously as her lover quickly exited the house. She wasn't worried about him. Unless the sky dropped on his head he would be fine. She was however worried about tsunami. The simple thought of being with anyone but Naruto revolted her, but the idea of being raped sent shivers down her spine. She had seen quite a few rape victims this past year. In roughly 60% of the camps she and her brother destroyed they had found kidnapped and abused women. Men could be truly sickening. Some of the girls had barely been 10 years old. Her dark thought was dispersed by a fairly loud pop and the sound of large feet running quietly in the direction of the shore Tazuna mentioned. Nariko smiled a bittersweet smile, thankful for the happy memory the sound called forth. Flashback. Naruto and Nariko were in the small kitchen area of the mountain safe house, eating a meal Nariko had cooked. Outside groups of clones were dispelling from the day's lessons. Suddenly Naruto looked up sharply. "I can't believe I didn't ask this before, but do you have a summons contract?" She looked up and swallowed what was in her mouth. "Yup, Jiraiya let me sign the Toad contract." "Well, I've got the Tiger contract. It was Ka-chan's and she had me sign it when I was a kid. I think you should sign it too, but that would mean that you can't summon toads anymore." Nariko thought about it. She liked the toads but she had only summoned them a handful of times so she wouldn't miss them. The real issue was that it was one of the very few gifts she had ever been given. But that was her old life, her Konoha life. "Okay, I'll sign it. Besides Minato Teme signed the Toad contract, and I'd rather have Ka-chan's." She finished with a winning smile. They quickly finished their meal, walked out of the house and stopped under the sakura tree. Naruto ran through a series of hand seals and slammed his right hand on the ground. When the smoke cleared there was a large white tiger with black stripes and a thin scroll held between its jaws. The tiger dropped the scroll at Naruto's feet and it grew wider until it reached the size of the scroll she had signed for the Toad contract. He unrolled the scroll and passed it to Nariko. Reading it she saw quite a few names, all of them were Uzumaki's. The last two were Uzumaki Naruto and Uzumaki Kushina. Having done this once already she knew what to do. Biting down on her thumb she signed her name and left a print of each of her 10 fingers. When she was done Naruto closed the scroll and gave it back to the tiger that then disappeared in a puff of smoke. "The hand signs are the same as all other contracts so I don't have to teach them to you. The contract, however, is not like others." Nariko got a puzzled look on her face. "What do you mean? I thought all contracts were different." He nodded. "Yes, all contracts are different because they summon different animals. But that's not what I'm talking about." He paused a moment and thought before continuing. "Tell me some of the contract animals you've seen." "Well, I've seen toads, slugs, snakes, dogs, monkeys and maybe some others," she replied. "Good. Now, don't you find it strange that a toad or a slug can fight on even grounds against a dog, a snake or a monkey?" Nariko blinked. She had never thought about it but it was kind of strange. A 50-foot-high slug was still a slug, and no slug could win a fight against a dog. Seeing her confusion Naruto went on. "I see you get my point. The thing is all summons contracts are about the same strength regardless of the animals they represent. There are however some stronger contracts and the tiger contract is one of them. There are only 3 contracts of the same strength: the salamander contract, the dragon contract and the phoenix contract. When you're ready you can summon the boss and she'll test you. If you pass the test she'll allow you to summon the tiger clan to help you in combat, but until then you should only summon them when you're not in a fight." Nariko tried picturing staying on a massive tiger's back until sunset. She sweat dropped. What's the test?" she asked. "She'll look into your eyes and see what your life was like. If she deems you worthy you pass the test." Naruto answered with an arched eyebrow. He could tell there was a story behind that question, but he had the feeling it was ridiculous enough that he was best off not knowing. End flashback. When she was ready she had summoned the tiger boss, Byako, and passed the test. Naruto had advised her to summon different members of the clan and get to know them so she could find who would be her best fight partner. She had quickly grown fond of the tigers and had adopted them as her favorite animal, so it was only natural that she had even taken to using their shape for her elemental chakra manipulations. With a sigh Nariko told Tazuna to sit down so she could treat his wounds, silently praying that Tsunami wouldn't be coming back with any she couldn't heal. As soon as he got out of the house, Naruto went through a set of hand seals and thrust his palm into the ground. His chakra spread out in a black sealing array, and with a pop and a puff of smoke, a white and gray tiger the size of a horse appeared. Leaping up, he straddled its, or in this case her, back. She was large by normal tiger standards, but she had finished growing, so she was rather small compared to other summons tigers. She wasn't part of the clan's main family, so she wouldn't gain their sheer size. That didn't mean that she was weak, however. Naruto had first met her when he had been developing his blood storm jutsu. He had overtrained and had to summon a tiger to help him get back to his camp. Since his chakra reserves had been quite low, he had ended up summoning a lesser tiger. She had barely been big enough to carry him at the time. When he had recovered, he summoned her again to thank her properly, and they just hit off. She had been his summons ever since. "Hey, Kisa-chan, we've got a time-sensitive mission here." He passed the apron over the large huntress's nose. "I need you to track down the woman whose scent is on this. She's been taken by bandits." "I don't think I have to explain why we have to hurry." The female growled at his words. She had always been disgusted at what humans can do to each other. She, for example, had decided not to take a mate, and while it was a rare occurrence, she knew that no member of her clan would even think of forcing her to. Spurred on by her anger, she sped off, trusting her nose to guide her to prey. The human scum were dead, they just didn't know it. Naruto rode with practiced ease as they sped down the shore. They reached what he guessed to be the spot where Tsunami was kidnapped, but Kisa didn't stop. She noticed that multiple other scents now joined the woman's. They were heavy with sweat, musk, and other even less pleasant odors, so she knew she was on the right track. After a few minutes following the trail, she ran into a lightly wooded area and came to a fairly wide river. The scents lead her up the river bank about half a mile until it suddenly stopped. The sun was dropping below the horizon now, so time was of the essence. Assuming that the bandits must have crossed the river, she pumped chakra into her feet and, using water walking, quickly crossed to the other side. She immediately picked the scents up again and followed them at a swift but somewhat reduced pace. Naruto looked around when Kisa's pace slowed. He knew better than to question her judgment and instead looked for the explanation. The underbrush from this side of the river was well trampled, creating a clear path into the denser parts of the forest. There were small puddles here and there, so he concluded that the bandits had used this path to get water from the river. Their camp wouldn't be far. When they saw the lights from the 3 campfires, Naruto slid down from Kisa's back. "Kisa, I want you to get near to the camp but stay out of sight. I'll try and find Tsunami-san." He whispered, "Wait for my signal, then attack from the west." The great predator disappeared silently into the shadows to take a position and wait. Naruto jumped up to the tree's lower branches and made his way toward the camp. He stopped when he reached the edge of the clearing and stretched his senses. He estimated the group to be about 30 men strong. They were quite well organized and, judging by the quality of some of their weapons, they had had more than a few successful raids. Sentries were patrolling in groups of 2 and guards at 2 of the 7 marquee-type tents. Naruto held back a sigh of relief. The leader of this group was a man who understood the dangers of the life he led and, while that would make the red-headed nin's job harder, it also meant that none of his men would be having any fun until all safety preparations were done. Sending chakra to his ears, Naruto closed his eyes and sifted through the cacophony. He first directed his attention towards the guarded tents. In the smaller one he could hear some gruff voices giving reports and making plans, nothing that he would find interesting. In the second tent, which was also easily the largest in camp, he could hear soft weeping and muffled prayers for help. He opened his eyes and, this time, allowed the small sigh of relief out. He was now fairly certain that the woman, or women, had been untouched. Now he had to decide how to proceed. The sentries patrolled in view of their comrades, so killing them and infiltrating the camp was a bad idea. He could go for a frontal assault, but the risk of Tsunami-san being harmed was unacceptable since she was one of Nariko-chan's precious people. Coming to a decision, he jumped from his perch and fell straight into the ground, leaving only a coin-sized hole where he should have landed. Naruto traveled underground, bending the earth around him through Doden manipulation. When he had covered the distance that separated him from the prisoners' tent, he resurfaced quickly, leaving a similar coin-sized hole beneath him. Scanning the room, he saw that it was an average marquee, large enough to host a good number of men. 4 sturdy wooden posts held up the fabric, and tied to 3 of them was a blindfolded woman. All were crying and had a few bruises, but other than that he was pleased to see that they were untouched. Making a quick circle of the room, Naruto placed a tag with a seal in each corner. When he finished, they all connected, creating an invisible silencing barrier. Of the 3 women, only one had the dark blue hair that featured in Nariko's description of Tsunami. Walking up to her, he gently removed the dirty cloth that covered her eyes. Tsunami was not having a good day. This was probably the worst day of her life since Kaizo was executed by Gato during his reign of terror. When her father and son had gone to try their luck fishing, she had put the picnic stuff away and, feeling a little tired, decided to take a nap. She had been forcefully awoken when strong hands had grabbed her arms and legs, lifting her roughly off the ground. She had screamed, kicked and thrashed around, but to no avail. Her captors were just too strong. When they had tied her up and left her blindfolded, she had calmed down enough to form coherent thoughts. She had first been worried for her father since she could vaguely remember seeing him slip as he tried to come to her aid. At first, she was grateful for that. She did not doubt that the men would have killed him if he had interfered. That was quickly replaced by worry and despair, however. She knew what she had been taken for, and she knew there was nothing she could do about it. For what seemed like hours she struggled against her bonds, but they were tight and didn't loosen at all. Hopelessness sunk in and she started crying. Tsunami flinched when she felt a pair of hands touch her face as they removed her blindfold. She blinked a few times to clear her eyes, but tears still clouded her vision. She was surprised when the person spoke in a soothing male voice. "Calm down, Tsunami-san, I'm not here to harm you. My name is Uzumaki Naruto, I'm Nariko's partner. She's at your house at the moment healing a wound your father sustained when he fell." Seeing her breathing calm and her posture relaxed, Naruto continued, "Now I'm going to cut you loose, okay?" Tsunami nodded quickly. His words and voice had started to allay her fear, but she desperately wanted to be free of her bindings. Naruto focused futon chakra in his palm and passed it over the rope, slicing right through it. As soon as she was freed, Tsunami leapt up and threw her arms around his neck as tears of relief cascaded down her cheeks. Wanting to move on, Naruto created 2 cage bushin and sent them to release the other 2 captives. With each woman being carried by a Naruto, they stepped out of the tent. The real Naruto let loose a low whistle, giving Kisa the signal to attack. The clones, on either side of him, blew out a sharp breath as if to blow out a candle. A bullet of highly compressed air shot from their lips and struck both guards between the eyes, punching into their skulls and out the other side. Seconds later, and before the bandits could get a handle on the situation, a pack of tigers attacked from the west of the clearing. Kisa had called on some of her clan sisters. Naruto chuckled softly. Different species or not, these bandits had called upon them the full wrath of righteous female fury. Ignoring the screams of pain and roars of satisfaction, Naruto left the clearing, sparing only enough time to create a squad, 4, of clones with sealing equipment. There was no point in letting the stolen goods go to waste, was there? It hadn't taken long for Nariko to heal Tazuna's head wound, as it hadn't been too serious. Since then they had been waiting in the sitting room and catching up on what happened since they last saw each other. For Nariko that meant telling them about her meeting Naruto and her years of training, though she didn't tell them that he was her brother. Nowadays the only time she would call him Oni-chan was during. When Naruto had asked her about it, she had quite casually stated that it turned her on. She finished by giving them an overview of the last year or so, and their quick trip to Suna. Tazuna told her of the fallout of her banishment and how Konoha was barely surviving because of it. That pleased the blonde, not only because the village got some well-deserved payback, but because it showed her just how many people cared for her. She silently promised that she would make time to visit them all and thank them for their support. Maybe they would become allies when Uzugakure was rebuilt. Just then the front door slid open and Naruto walked in with a sleeping Tsunami cradled in his arms. Seeing the older woman's arms around his neck and her head nestled against his chest made a burst of jealousy flash through Nariko's eyes. She knew it was irrational, but Naruto was hers and she didn't want anyone, even one of her precious people, being even slightly intimate with him. Seeing his Imouto's reaction, Naruto hastily, but carefully, passed his sleeping charge to her father. "She's just tired, Tazuna-san," he reassured. "She had a stressful day and we had to accompany 2 other women to their homes before we came back." Thankfully none of them were touched. He finished looking at the bridge builder dead in the eye to make sure he understood. Tazuna sighed heavily, relieved that his daughter's ordeal hadn't been as bad as he feared it would have. After thanking the Uzumakis he made his way up the stairs, Inari following, and put his daughter to bed. Inari curled up next to his mother and Tazuna sat in an armchair. They would be with her when she woke up. Naruto silently followed his partner to the bedroom their hosts had offered them. When he entered he saw tags stuck to the corners of the room, confirming that Nariko had already put a silencing barrier in place. Locking the door he threw his trench coat off, walked up to her and pulled her into a tight hug. Not likely either but true, he said to himself as he watched Tsunami happily place bowls of rice in front of him. He voiced his thanks as she went back to the kitchen, and shrugged in his mind. They must have learned to deal with the shit life throws at them during Gato's reign. So how long are you staying? Tazuna asked. He had bags under his eyes from watching her all night. Inari was still asleep. Since his sister was eating with gusto, Naruto answered. I don't know. We only came because Natsu-chan wanted to see you guys, so it's up to her. But we won't stay too long. Now that we've taken out 2 Akatsuki members, people will be after us, either to kill us or to persuade us to join them. He paused to take a sip of tea. We also have a project to get started on soon. Nariko nodded. They wouldn't be staying long. In truth, she didn't have anything else to do here. She was no longer the attention-starved young girl she had been. Back when she lived in Konoha she would have wanted to stay with these kind people for as long as possible, but now seeing them and catching up was enough. She smiled as she munched on a piece of fish. It was proof that she had not only grown stronger as a kunoichi, but she had grown stronger as a person. What project is that? Tsunami asked curiously as she re-entered the room and sat down. Is there any way we can help? Naruto turned to his sister and raised an eyebrow. She finished her mouthful and patted her lips with a napkin before speaking. Well, we only mentioned it yesterday, so I haven't thought about it much, but we're going to try and rebuild Uzugakure. Besides, I'm not sure where to start. I mean, I've never even been to Whirlpool Country, so it's kind of hard to plan anything. She started tapping her chin with her right index finger. Yeah, that's it, we should go there first and get an idea of what we're working with before we start making plans. Naruto nodded. Yeah, that's a good idea. I've only been once actually, and that was just a passing visit to pay my respects to the land of our ancestors. If you see what I mean. He turned back to his host. I think we'll leave after breakfast. We'll go to Uzu and see what the place is like. We'll make our plans from there. When the meal was finished they said their goodbyes, asking Tsunami to pass them on to Inari when he woke up, and made their way to the docks. So how long do you think it'll take us to get there, Naruto-kun? Nariko asked. I think we'll just walk all the way, so it'll probably take us a week or so. Since Uzu was destroyed there are no ships that go directly. He explained as they reached the sea. Last time I took a boat that was going from Lightning Country to Water Country, jumped overboard halfway through and water walked the rest of the way. There are smaller islands on the way, so we'll be able to rest. Okay. Nariko stretched her arms above her head and arched her back, grinning as she saw her partner's eyes rake her figure. They started their long journey to their Okawa-san's birthland. Nariko rocked back and fell on her bum. She looked to her left and heaved a tired sigh. It had been over a week since they had reached the ruined island that once housed the proud and powerful village of Uzugakure. She had been rather disappointed actually. She had known that all that was left of her Okawa-san's village was ruins, but, well, that was it. For some reason, while she had expected ruins, she hadn't expected just ruins. Upon their arrival, Uzu could be considered a large pile of rubble with wild vegetation pushing through and a fair amount of skeletons scattered around. She had freaked out when Naruto picked up a bleach-white skull and asked her, oh so casually, if she thought it might be one of their uncles or cousins. She had paid him back by having her clones collect all the skulls she could find, setting them all in concentric circles around a central ring, ripping her clothes off, getting on all four and giving him a view of her already dripping nether regions that she knew would rob him of all manner of self-restraint. He had gone through what she had come to recognize as the 3 steps. He went through every time she came up with something new to try. Step 1, he gives her the slightly freaked out, why the fuck would you want to do that, expression. Step 2, he goes through with it because there's nothing he wouldn't do for his Natsu-chan. Step 3, he ends up liking it and pounding her into a UAL coma. It was only when they woke up the next morning surrounded by skulls, all of which were looking right at them, that they realized just how disturbing what they had done was. She sighed again. She had become more perverted than one of Erotami's books. The day after they christened the island had been decidedly less enjoyable. She hadn't seen much of her partner since then, only at mealtimes and the moments before or after they slept. They had been working non-stop since then, and she could honestly say that, so far, building Uzu had been as boring as one of Haruka's history lectures. Flashback. So where do we start, Naruto-kun? He looked at her contemplatively, weighing his words before he spoke. Well, no offense, but I'm better at the whole architectural business. So I think I'll take care of the more complicated parts, and it'll be easier for me to just show you when I'm done. Noriko nodded in agreement. He was better at that sort of thing. Nonetheless, I've thought about how we should organize the village and, most importantly, how to prevent this. He made a sweeping motion with his arm, indicating the destroyed remains that surrounded them, from happening again. Noriko spoke up, deciding to voice one of her concerns. Are you sure there's enough space? She asked dubiously. I mean, from what you had said I had guessed that it was a relatively small island, but... She looked around theatrically. I didn't expect it to be this small. I doubt you could fit half of Konoha in here. I know it's just the two of us for now, but eventually, there'll be more people and, well, they'll need space to live. A small frown creased Naruto's brow. Yeah, I know what you mean. I wondered about that myself when I first came. From the stories, Okawa-san told me the island was a lot bigger and the village itself was bigger than Konoha. My best guess is that the battles were violent enough that a lot of the island was destroyed and lost to the sea. They both scowled slightly at the loss of so much of their mother's heritage before Naruto shook himself out of his daze. Anyway, for what I have planned, the smaller size is going to play to our advantage. We'll use the island for trade and diplomatic meetings. I think we should also build a stadium for when, and if, we host Chunin exams. Her eyes widened as she caught on to what he intended to do. You want to build the entire village underground? She exclaimed incredulously. Is that even possible? I mean, the safe houses are one thing, but an entire village? Besides, even if it is possible, there's only so much space under this island and, unless we want to be dependent on trade alliances, we'll also need space for farming and livestock. Then there are training areas to account for. Naruto raised his hands in front of him in a placating manner. Hey, calm down. I've thought about that, which is exactly why I'll be taking care of it. He said, what I want you to do is build a huge stone wall all around the island. I'd say around 60 feet high and 30 feet thick. You can use the rubble for raw materials and make it as dense and strong as possible. There's no hurry, my part won't be over quickly, so take your time. He scratched his chin in thought. So far I've focused mostly on the underground parts, so if you want I can leave the surface up to you. She thought about it for a moment before nodding. Yeah, I can do that. I guess it'll just be a smaller model of a normal shinobi village. We'll need a small hospital, a fancy building for all the political crap, the stadium, like you said, and also a place like the Forest of Death for the second part of the exam. But if the island is mainly going to be used for trade, then most of the buildings will be hotels, shops and warehouses. That sounds about right, Naruto replied. He reached into his trench coat and, with a small flare of chakra, pulled out a small brown scroll. Here, in this, there are other scrolls with more raw materials sealed inside. The details are all written down on the labels. When you've used up all the junk around here you can use that. He chuckled. There should be more than enough rock considering there's half a mountain in there. He got to his feet and dusted himself off. When you start on the building, remember to use clones and civilian methods, rather than elemental manipulation, since civilians will need to be able to do repairs. End flashback. Noriko got back on her feet and moved to the left to get started on a new part of the wall. At first, she had thought that it would be an easy job, but she quickly came to realize just how wrong that assumption was. Doden manipulation was one of her best elements, so building a 60-foot high, 30-foot thick wall in 10-foot wide sections wasn't all that hard for her. The difficult, and time-consuming, part was compressing the loose earth and rock into one dense block of stone. It was many times denser than anything she would even consider using in combat, for the simple reason that, even with her skill, it required far too much mental concentration. As such, 9 days later, she was barely halfway done. What made things worse was that she had already done a good 15 sections when the training from their last months in the mountain safe house gave her an idea. Flashback. She had just finished reading the scrolls on Doden Jutsu after mastering Doden manipulation. They were now sitting in their favorite spot under the sakura tree and Naruto was explaining the next step in her training. Okay, first I have a question for you. You remember the first time we met and I killed those rude Anbu? She gave a single nod. Yeah, you made a cloud with their blood and made it rain all over the clearing. She answered with a smirk. That was awesome. Thanks, but how do you think I did it? She blinked, opened her mouth, and then closed it. Seeing her confusion, Naruto grinned. Well, at least you didn't just assume it was a kinjutsu or a kekai genki, which is what most shinobi do. Now, so far you've used neutral, or normal, chakra and elemental chakra. Although you've only trained the elements you have an affinity for. But do you know what other types of chakra there are? Noriko only had to think for a moment before she got the answer. You mean sub-elements? Naruto pushed himself up onto his feet and started pacing back and forth. You see, that's the problem. The academy teaches us that for chakra there are 5 elements: fire, water, earth, lighting, and wind. Then that there are sub-elements made from a combination of 2 elements: ice from water and wind, wood from water and earth, boil from water and fire, etc. What's worse is that students are taught that only Keki Genkai users have access to these sub-elements. Well, they're right, aren't they? She asked with a confused look, to which Naruto vigorously shook his head. Not at all. He tapped 2 fingers to his heart, where she knew their Okawa-san was sealed. You've already seen my eternal ice, and the only Keki Genkai I have is the large chakra reserves of the Uzumaki clan. He stopped in front of her. What I've found is that there is a chakra type for just about everything, well, every natural thing. I doubt there's ice cream chakra or ramen chakra. Pushing that thought aside, he continued his explanation. Rather than calling it sub-elemental chakra, I call it complex chakra. What you have to do is mix the right chakra elements in the right way and the right amounts. Kekai Genki are just shortcuts that make the process instinctual or subconscious. I doubt that bloodline limit users have any idea of what they are doing. The reason other shinobi can't do it is that they don't have the elemental control needed to do so. That's also the reason the Sharingan can copy complex chakra type jutsu but not use them. Are you following so far? Noriko nodded with a slightly dazed expression on her face, not because she was having difficulty understanding, but because of the possibilities that her brother's theory opened up. Good, he said. At the moment you've only mastered 3 elements, so your possibilities are somewhat limited. From now on I'll let you decide when you train your remaining elements and when you try and find complex chakra combinations. You'll have to keep in mind that mastering Raiden and Suiden will take a lot longer even with Kage Bushin. The same goes for complex chakra. The mix will be a lot easier if it uses the elements you have an affinity for. She frowned a little. But if I use a couple of thousand clones a day, it couldn't take that long to master them, could it? I mean, from what you said before, I got to this level faster than most get to the level needed for hand-sealed ninjutsu. It can't take that much longer. Naruto shook his head in negative. You're underestimating how much easier it is when you have an affinity. There's a reason so many shinobi never reach Junin status, and it's often because they don't have the second required affinity. Of course, there are some Junin who don't have 2 elements, but they're usually specialists or are given advancement for political reasons. At the moment in all the elemental nations, the only non-bloodline user that I know can use ninjutsu from all 5 elements is Jiraiya. An accomplishment that took most of his career to achieve, and even then, from what I've heard, he can't use anything above C, maybe B rank jutsu in some elements. And that's with hand seals. His face scrunched up. There's also this guy called Kakuzu who is rumored to have mastered all 5 elements, but I don't know much about him, only what's in the black market bingo book, which isn't a lot since most of the people who fought him didn't live to tell about it. He paused and sat back down. If I used hand seals I would be considered a master in all the main elements, but with that I only have mastery of Suiden, Futon and Raiden. I'm pretty advanced in Kaden and Doden, enough that I can use them in battle or for complex chakra, but I've still got a ways to go for mastery, and I've been Kage Bunshin training for years. Noriko's shoulders slumped in disappointment, but she quickly squared them. She wouldn't let something like that get to her. If she had to train long and hard, then that's exactly what she'd do. So what should I do from now on? She asked. Well, as I said, the two other main elements will take a while, so you should do what I do and have a bunch of clones work on them whenever you can. For complex chakra, well, at first it's more a question of understanding than training. You have to understand how something works and then try to recreate it. That's why I had you learn about physics, chemistry and other such things. He tipped his head back in thought, staring into the cavern's fake sky. For example, tell me, what is ice? The female Uzumaki blinked at the question. Frozen water, I guess. She answered blandly. Sure, she could give a more detailed response if she had to, but unlike her partner, she had no love for the theoretical side of things. Naruto sighed at her lack of enthusiasm. When frozen, water is a lot less mobile than when it's at a normal temperature, which is why it becomes solid. To mold Hyouten, ice, chakra, you have to use futon chakra to steal, or remove, the heat from the Suiden chakra. If you don't use enough, you'll just end up with cold water, and if you use too much, you'll create ice, but the excess wind will break it. That doesn't sound too hard, she said with a slight creasing of her brow. Naruto just shrugged. It isn't, the thing is most ninjas don't have the control to pull it off. Also, very few study civilian sciences, so they don't understand how things work. But don't get too comfy, ice is one of the easiest. When you try to do something with 3 elements, it gets a whole lot harder. I've got notes on the complex chakra types I've found, but you should try and find some yourself by starting with your affinities. Besides, I think half the fun is in discovering them, and while I have found quite a few, there are still loads more, so you'd best get some practice. Noriko gave another nod to show she agreed. Then she tilted her head to one side, her long ponytail swaying with the movement. Hey, what about your blood? Yeah, it's my signature jutsu and it's what gives me the nickname, Bloody Storm. I made that up myself, by the way. He smiled sheepishly. I figured that if I'm going to have a nickname, it might as well be a cool one. Anyway, blood-type chakra is a mix of water, because of the organic aspect, fire, because of the energy aspect, and earth, because of the mineral aspect. You can also say that water makes it liquid, fire gives it warmth, and earth brings stability. The more detailed parts are kind of hard to explain, but I do have it all written down if you want. Looking at his Imouto, he realized that she was only half listening, already trying to come up with her complex chakra types. Smiling at his student's faraway look, Naruto gave one last piece of advice. Keep in mind that you can use the same elements, but if you use different amounts or mix them differently, you can get completely different results. End flashback. Noriko had found a few complex chakra combinations connected to her affinities. She had also started training in water and lightning manipulation, but as expected, progress was slow. The first had been inspired by her memories of Gaara and his tenant. By combining wind and earth, she had successfully reproduced sand chakra and practiced its manipulation. Like ice, the concept was fairly simple. The Doden broke down the earth and stone, and Futon controlled the movement. The result could create barriers of great density or desert-like storms that flayed flesh from bone. Of course, having mastery over wind and earth didn't give her mastery over sand, so she wasn't anywhere near the Cage's level. But she could do some decent stuff and was only getting better. She had mixed fire and wind to create heat chakra. At first, the combination had only produced stronger flames that often escaped control and blew up in her face, but with a constant effort, she had pulled through. The trick was to mold them together in such a way that the Kaiden burnt the wind, rather than having the futon fan the fire. It could best be described as hot air, but where a gust of wind would blow the enemy away. A gust of heat would, if properly used, would roast them like an oven. By adding the right amount of water to heat, something she was lucky to achieve with her current level of Suiden manipulation, the blonde Uzumaki had discovered humidity. While attacks from this type of chakra weren't as hot or destructive, they could make things rust or rot at incredible speeds. Something Sasori had found out the hard way. Her favorite, however, was lava. It was a mix of fire and earth that offered a good combination of attack and defense. The only downside was that it was rather slow. However, she hadn't let that discourage her and had taken to using heat to compensate. The combination is what led to her chosen alias of Burning Wave. Back to the matter at hand, it was after she had completed 15 sections of the Uzu wall that she had come up with an idea. When the lava from her techniques cooled down, it left a mass of rock. What she picked up on was that lava, with its liquid state, was easier to shape than stone. So she went back to the first section of the wall and melted the whole thing. She used her lava manipulation to hold it in shape, and then she compressed it beyond what she had been able to do with earth manipulation. She had used more raw stone to make up for the loss of volume and thus ended up with an even denser wall. The major downer was that she had to hold the manipulation until the lava cooled. But she had clones for that, and the use of wind manipulation to create a low-level breeze accelerated the process. So here she was so many days later, halfway around the island, and thoroughly cursing the idea of being Shodemazukage. Patience, after all, only gets you so far. Naruto was having fun. He had always liked planning, researching and inventing things, and seeing his projects through was the icing on the cake. What he hadn't told Nariko was that he had intended to rebuild Uzu even before he met her. He hadn't planned on making it a shinobi village, more of a tribute to his mother's memory. But the fact remained that he had had a lot of time to think things through and draw blueprints. He wasn't sure what had made his ancestors choose the island. It did have good sea access for trade, but that was pretty much cancelled by the whirlpool fields that surrounded it. The whirlpools themselves did provide defense from warships, and distracted water-walking shinobi enough to make them easy targets. But the destruction of Uzu had proven that it was a mistake to rely too heavily on it. He planned for New Uzu to be even harder to conquer than Taki and had poured his knowledge in engineering, building, sealing, and complex chakra into the project. While the safe houses were useful, they were also testing runs for his arrays. Recreating an ecosystem that was not only self-sufficient but in many ways incomplete was a lot of hard work, and a lot of things could go wrong. The safe houses had water, grass, flowers, trees, koi fish and a hot spring. If they weren't lined in sealing arrays that purified the water and air and fed the appropriate complex chakra types, everything would have been dead in a matter of weeks. He didn't want to build an underground village, only for it to fail and kill itself because of a faulty seal. First was the island. It would be the main access point to the deeper village and would host most of the business with other villages. Since it was the most visible part, it would have to show Uzu's strength in an impressive display of both opulence and military might. The buildings would have to be both beautiful and intimidating, but that would mostly be Nariko's job. His first course of action was to create an army of clones to construct what would be the equivalent of the cage tower. They quickly got to work, digging trenches for the foundations, unsealing raw materials and preparing them for use. Meanwhile, he started digging a hole, a very big and deep hole that descended at a 45-degree angle. The way to New Uzu was open. She had finished the wall. It had taken her another week, but she had finished. As a bonus, her lava manipulation had improved by a fair amount. The island was now surrounded by a high and sturdy wall at its very edge. She had had to fix the ground in some points where jutsu damage had eroded it. It certainly made an impressive sight. If it wasn't for the change in color, the wall would seem like a continuation of the island floor. At regular intervals, she had constructed 100-foot-high watchtowers. They weren't overly large, but if war ever came to the island, they could host a few squads to hold back attackers until reinforcements arrived. Being 100 feet above their enemies would also give the defenders the advantage. The only breach was about 150 yards wide and was the entrance to the harbor, and at each side, she had built a more impressive tower. While these two towers weren't higher, they were considerably larger and could host more than enough shinobi to repel anyone who sought to force their way in. From there, two shorter walls went inland for about 100 feet or so to prevent anyone from sneaking in. For a bird's-eye view of the Uzu wall, picture a circle. The island is pretty much circular, with a small part rubbed off at the top and a short line coming inwards from each end. The last step had been to paint chakra nullifying seals on all the outside face. The chakra nullifying seal was a fairly complex array, and while she understood it, she wasn't capable of modifying it, so she was using a model Naruto had designed. This type of seal wasn't to be confused with chakra restraining seals used on captives. The nullifying seal worked by dispersing all chakra that touched it. The energy wasn't absorbed or reversed, it was simply dashed away, like warm air when it hits a cold surface. And of course, in the same way, that a cold surface could only take so much arm air before it heated up, a nullifying seal could only take so much chakra before it failed. In the case of this particular seal, the amount of chakra was defined by how much was used to charge the seal. Nariko had charged each seal, with one seal per section of wall, with roughly half a tail of Yuki. A half-tail being about as much as the wall could take without becoming a health hazard. Of course, with Yuki being many times more potent, that meant that the seals could disperse a lot of chakra. She estimated that it would take at least 30 high A-rank jutsu in quick succession to break the seal, and then they still had to destroy the wall itself. All in all, she was proud of her work, and now she was going to have fun designing the beautiful topside of their village. She could see her partner's clones working on the main building, and from the looks of things that's where the entrance to the underside of the village would be too. So far it looked like he was going for a traditional feudal castle look. That was mildly surprising since, while it would look good, it was a mostly wooden structure and thus not as enduring as the usual stone construction of a cage tower. But she didn't let that bother her. He would probably paint more security seals on the thing than one could find on all the other cage towers combined. Enough of that, she had her building to do. The first, and probably least elaborate part, would be the warehouses. They would be located at the harbor and would serve mostly as a display area for future buyers, at least how she pictures it. After all, why would need buildings just for storage when a well-designed seal was many times better, both for security and practicality? In fact, why didn't most villages use storage seals? She had seen the large convoys of wood that left Konoha and hadn't questioned it at the time. But seeing the scroll Naruto gave her and the ridiculously huge amounts of wood and other materials he seemed to carry around with him, she couldn't help but wonder why others didn't do the same. Then again, most civilians couldn't mold chakra, or rather they didn't take the time to learn how, so using scrolls for commercial transport may not be possible for them. She would just have to make sure that in her village that wasn't the case. There was also the question of how ships would get past those blasted whirlpool fields without ending up as driftwood. Now that she had finished the straightforward, if exhausting, wall, Noriko was starting to realize the difference between wanting to build a village and building it. She hadn't thought things through. Deciding to go about it another way, she plopped down into a cross-legged sitting position with her left elbow on her knee and her chin resting on the heel of her left hand. Placing her right palm on the loose soil in front of her, she started channeling Doden chakra and manipulating it. She had memorized the general lay of the island, so she first raised a miniature equivalent. She proceeded to add the walls, towers and what she had seen of Naruto's castle. Then she started playing around, adding warehouses and hotels, moving them around, changing one to a restaurant or a shop, coming up with different street layouts, trying different ideas for the stadium and generally messing about to find the best setup. In the end, she decided on a fairly simple layout. The warehouses would be built along the waterfront so that there was easy access to the ships in the harbor. A customs office would control all in and outgoing, be it goods or people. Next would be shops, restaurants and whatever other commerce there was. However, she wasn't going to build those yet and would simply divide the space into plots. That way shop owners would have a say in how their establishment was built. The third circle, as she liked to call them, would be composed of hotels and private houses for the more prestigious visitors and guests. There was still a good bit of space until the castle, which was located about 2/3 of the way inland, and she intended to have the extra room converted into a park or garden. It would serve a dual purpose. First, it would be beautiful enough to make the jealousy of any daimyo. And second, if there was an attack and if the enemy got this far, it would make a good battlefield. A battlefield where the defender would have a large advantage since she intended to set up remotely activated defenses. It would be a death trap. Over to the west side of the island, with the harbor being at the north, would be the exam complex. It would consist of examination rooms, a team testing area similar to the Forest of Death, and the stadium itself. She had already decided that it would be used not only for eventual Chunin exams hosted by Uzu but to test the teams they would send to Chunin exams in other villages. She had learned how important the village's reputation would be for prospective clients and wouldn't risk sending under-trained teams. The rest of the island would be a mixture of different terrains for training grounds. There wasn't much to say about the building themselves. The warehouses were just large empty rooms built of wood and mostly stone bricks. The shops were waiting for owners to be built. The hotels were all quite luxurious but weren't innovative, simply bringing slight modifications to the usual styles. The houses were divided into two groups. First were the houses for important guests such as cages and daimyos. The second was the houses for honored guests such as Koyuki, Gaara and Tazuna. Of course, she hoped that they would be allowed access to the deeper parts of Uzu, but that would mostly depend on Naruto. Speaking of, she thought as she created thousands of clones and sent them off in groups to start construction. It's been 2 weeks since I've last seen him. That was by far the longest amount of time they'd been apart in more than 3 years. She pushed the thought aside. They were going to live very long lives, so there were bound to be times when they were apart. Shifting a bit to one side, she sat in front of clear space and started trying out new ideas for the stadium. The corner of Naruto's mouth twitched in a small smile as he felt the shift in his chakra. He had been digging for about a day and a half now, going slowly to make sure that there would be no cave-ins. The shift was due to the change from earth to water as his chakra probe breached the side of the island near to the ocean floor. Digging a tunnel with Doden manipulation was a simple matter of creating a probe in the desired shape and perhaps a dozen feet long, then pushing the earth outwards, compacting it to reinforce the walls, floor and ceiling. It had become harder as he got deeper. The soft earth giving place to hard rock, but that ensured that the tunnel wouldn't collapse under the increased mass above it. He was now getting to the delicate part, ending the tunnel without flooding it. But he had, of course, planned for this. His eternal ice was the key to success. The name never failed to bring a smile to his face since it wasn't ice. The chakra composition was very close, incredibly close actually, but there was still a difference. When he created it, he had been trying to find a way to prevent the ice from melting. He had heard of a clan from Kiri whose Kekai Genki allowed them to use ice that didn't melt, something he couldn't claim. He had already been quite advanced in complex chakra by that time, but there was one aspect he couldn't quite harness. Some of the sub-elements were commonly attributed properties that didn't make sense. Ice, for example, melts. Whether infused with chakra or not, when faced with a strong enough flame, ice melts. So why then does that clan's ice not melt? Likewise, the Shodem's Mokuton gave him the ability to bind the Biju and even control them. The obvious question, though not so obvious for the general masses, was, why would wood allow him to control demons? Creating wood chakra and ice chakra was easy for Naruto, but neither had those special properties. His best guess was that the complex chakra created by the Kekai Genki was more just than ice or wood. So he had experimented and eventually found a solution. Eternal ice was made of 3 base elements: water, wind and earth. Like normal ice, it was mostly made of the first 2 and in the same way. The difference was that the earth chakras stabilized the whole and gave a complex chakra that would be better named as crystal chakra. It was incredibly hard but also remarkably light. The reason he continued to call it eternal ice rather than crystal was to commemorate how he discovered it. That was what he was going to do now using the abundant seawater. The village wouldn't only be underground. It would be underwater, protected by swirling whirlpools and treacherous currents. He started by creating a batch of shadow clones and having them stand at regular intervals along the tunnel. He could do it bit by bit like Naruto did the wall, but since the clones wouldn't need to use much chakra, only enough to maintain the manipulation, this way would be faster. Seeing his clones in position, he closed his eyes and focused on his chakra. Elemental manipulation was a question of infusing the chakra into the correct base element and then shaping it. This was the reason most shinobi couldn't perform Suiden Jutsu without a source of water, Doden Jutsu out at sea, etc. Contrary to popular belief, the Nidaime Hokage's bloodline didn't permit him to create water out of nothing, but to draw the ambient water from the air around him. Something any skilled Suiden user could learn with enough effort. It was possible to create something from chakra, but it required extreme amounts of chakra to do so, and even then it was an unstable parity. The Kage Bushin was a perfect example of this, flesh and bone created from large amounts of neutral chakra, but a single hit and the entire construct would collapse. Molding his chakra into the combination for crystal chakra, he focused it, gathering into the air around him, into the remaining rock in front of him and into the seawater beyond. The rock gradually turned into a transparent blue and expanded outwards. Naruto made the crystal pass along the tunnel, coating the surfaces in a thick layer until it was halfway towards his first clone. The clone then took over the manipulation and directed it along his section of the tunnel until it reached the next clone, and so on. The original kept producing and feeding the crystal down the chain. He had taken care to stop early enough that he had a large enough rock source to do the combination. It was a good thing that the eternal ice used very little earth in comparison to wind and water. When the chain reached its end, the last clone the clone, settled everything into place by spilling it out to cover the floor, giving the impression of a smooth surface made of precious stone, using the earth chakra portion to give it a darker, opaque color. The clone then dispelled itself. Receiving the memory feedback, the real Naruto stopped the backwards flow and started extending the tunnel forwards until it connected with the ocean floor, keeping the end closed so as not to drown himself in a flood of saltwater. He stopped at that point, knowing that the next part would be both time-consuming and chakra expensive, even for a chakra monster like him. Flashback. And this is more of a partial flashback. It will be continued at a later date, when the time is right. Nariko collapsed onto Naruto's bare chest, her firm smooching between their perspiring bodies. It had been a few days since they first made love, and they had spent most of that time putting the expression, going at it like bunnies, to the test. That left large groups of shadow clones smoldering in jealousy as they were forced to continue training while listening to the increasingly loud moans and screams of delight. Not to mention having to clean up the flooding left in the wake of the two lovebirds. Needless to say, if it wasn't for the fact that clone had to do their assigned task and would disperse on their creator's death, there would have been a full-blown revolution in the safe house. Blissfully ignoring her doppelganger's malcontent, the female Uzumaki pushed herself onto her elbows so she could peer into her lover's eyes. She shifted her weight onto her right arm and, with her left index finger, traced across his collarbone, eliciting a small shiver from him. She continued down, past the spot above his heart where their mother was sealed. The seal doesn't show unless chakra is being channeled into it. And down to his stomach, her finger rising and falling with the dips and rises of his toned abs. "What's this one for?" she asked, trailing her finger along with the scrawl of a large seal. "It looks like the one I have for Kyuubi." Naruto flicked his eyes down, even though he knew what she was talking about, having placed it there himself. "It only looks like yours because I wanted it to," he answered. It's a common practice for seal masters to have the actual array of their more complex seals hidden in a design. It makes it harder for others to understand it. This particular seal does quite a few things. "How big do you think my chakra reserves are?" "I don't know, but you're easily cage level." Naruto snorted softly, causing her to give him a frowning pout. He shook his head in amusement. "Sorry, it's just that a cage is generally defined as the strongest ninja in the village. So technically, if there aren't any ninja above Chunin level." He pushed the thought aside and got back to answering his question. "I've already told you that the Uzumaki have large chakra reserves. Okawa-chan, for example, had the largest in Konoha. I'd say she had at least 3 times as much as Minato, and she was a kenjutsu specialist, so they weren't as large as they could have been. There's a reason the KKI, Kumo Kiri-iwa, alliance didn't even try to get Uzu to join them and just launched a surprise attack. They couldn't afford to have them as enemies. A fully trained Uzumaki could, quite literally, throw high-level jutsu for hours on end. You, however, have the Kyuubi on top of the Uzumaki Kekkai Genki, so your reserves are already higher than even the best Uzumaki ninjutsu specialists were. You could already create 1,000 Kage Bushin when your chakra control was all but non-existent. And that's a lot, since I never saw Ka-chan make more than about 1,500. Hang on a minute, Nariko interrupted incredulously. What do you mean she could only make 1,500? I can create over 5,000 if I want. Hell, I've seen Kakashi make at least 50, and that was after a fight with Zabuza. Naruto lifted an eyebrow. I think you're underestimating how hard the jutsu is to perform. There's a good reason it's classified as a kenjutsu. Hell, there are a bunch of good reasons. I've known Kakashi, and I seriously doubt that he can create more than 5 shadow clones, especially given how lazy he became after he got his teammates Sharingan. Her eyebrows rose to her hairline at that snippet, but she was too curious about the previous matter to ask about it. Well, I'm telling you, I saw him make at least 50. He sighed. Okay, tell me what happened. Well, that's it. He fought Zabuza, then Gato arrived with his thugs, so I created a bunch of shadow clones, and so did he. Okay, but are you sure he made Kage Bushin? He countered. Keep in mind that the various Bunshin techniques are some of the easiest to do without seals. I doubt he's smart enough, but he could even have made the hand seal for Kage Bushin and used Mizu Bushin instead, or Tsuchi Bushin, or even a regular Academy Bushin. The fact is that you saw him make a bunch of clones and you assumed they were the same type as yours. Her mouth opened and shut a few times as she realized he was right. Besides, he added, if it was that easy to everyone would do Cage Bushin training. Hang on a minute, again. She exclaimed before finishing sheepishly at the volume of her voice. Does that mean Ka-san had, 300 times more chakra than Kakashi? He shook his head no. Not at all. Remember the basic scrolls on chakra. At any given time the human body produces chakra and, if the ninja's reserves are full, that chakra leaks out of his body. As the ninja grows, gets stronger and trains, the amount produced slowly gets bigger. As it gets bigger it puts a strain on the ninja's chakra coils and ends up damaging them. Fortunately, the damage is little enough that the ninja's natural healing repairs it and, in the process of doing so, reinforces and thickens the chakra coils. The more a ninja's reserves grow, the thicker and tougher their coils get. The Uzumaki naturally have thicker and tougher chakra coils, so we can handle the strain of Cage Bushin much better. In your case, the Kyuubi adds more pressure to your coils, forcing them to develop even more, which is why you have big reserves even for an Uzumaki. She nodded slowly in understanding, then looked at him, confused. What about you? I know you can make just as many clones as me, but you don't have a demo. She trailed off, eyes wide as she looked back down at the seal on his belly. Whoa, Naruto exclaimed. Slow down there, Haim. I don't have a demon sealed in me. I would have told you ages ago if that were the case. No, the seal has a couple of purposes. One of which is to create a thin barrier all around my body that stops my chakra from leaking out and forces it back into my chakra coils. That puts more strain on them and so on and so on. So, she started hesitantly. How big are your chakra stores? Well, I painted the seal on when I was 18, so I've had it for about 6 years. I also got some serious boosts by taking chakra pills when my reserves were already full. He frowned at the memory. That hurts like a bitch, by the way. So, yeah, my reserves are quite a lot bigger than yours still. He grinned at her. You can call me the chakra monster. End flashback. When he was well rested, Naruto headed down to the end of the tunnel. He walked, using chakra to stick the smooth and slippery slope of the eternal ice tunnel. There wasn't much to see, the violent waters prevented any kind of life from taking root. But that didn't stop him from taking pleasure in the fact that he may well be the first person ever to see such depths. When he got to the end, he ran his hand over the crystal wall in front of him as he looked out onto the rocky ocean bed. He settled down in a lotus position and took a couple of deep breaths to steady himself for the strain to come. Placing his palms firmly on the floor beneath him, he once again molded crystal chakra and sent it out in pulses, eyes closed and concentrating on what his senses detected. Crystal came first, obviously, and then there was water, a layer of sand, and finally hard cold rock. All in all, he had everything he needed. Digging deep into his reserves, he pulled up a large amount of chakra, molded it into crystal chakra and spread it out, giving it the shape he desired. The overall form was cylindrical, but with the top being curved like a squished dome so that it could withstand the pressure of all the water pressing down on it. Naruto pumped more and more chakra into it until the circumference roughly matched that of Konoha. From his position near the ocean bed, the cylinder rose about 600 feet, 200 meters, to give ample space for the town to be built. It then descended twice as far under the seafloor, finishing in a flat bottom surface. As soon as he had the shape in place, making sure that it was properly connected to the tunnel, Naruto allowed his chakra to start drawing in the physical elements required to create the submerged village's shell. He controlled it so that water was only drawn from the inside, or rather what would become the inside when he finished, and rock was taken from the areas that needed to be cleared for the shell to take place. The outward effect was incredible. The wind was sucked down the tunnel at gale force speeds, forcing Naruto to divert chakra into his butt cheeks and thighs just to stay seated. The water level inside the dome-shaped part started to drop as the shimmering transparent blue shell of eternal ice started to form. Cracks appeared regularly as the weight of the outside water pressed down on it, forcing Naruto to pump even more chakra in to compensate. Sweat poured down his face only to be blown off by the forceful winds as the storm passed. The excess rock cracked as it was pushed out of the way of the forming crystal. For what seemed like hours but could have been days, he lent every part of his concentration to his task, building the walls up to 60 feet thick, 20 m, in all places. When all the water on the inside was used, he started draining from outside the shell, wind still raging around him, until he was finally done. Naruto slumped onto his back and uncurled his legs, trying to stretch out the stiffness. He was whacked. He still had a bit of chakra left, but the mental drain gave him a headache of ungodly proportions. With a last small effort, he made a group of 5 clones and sent them to check his work. He then promptly fell asleep. When he woke up, he sifted through his memories and found the clones' observations. It wasn't a perfect circle, which was to be expected, but there were no cracks or thin spots, so he was rather happy with himself. Getting to his feet, he walked into the dome, exiting the tunnel without problem since the clones had opened it. Time to get to work. First, he created a large group of 1,000 cage bushin to start carving the environment seals into the shell. The tunnel provided air for the moment, but when the village was full of people, that wouldn't be enough. Each seal was carved 3 times using complex manipulation to place an array at 5, 10 and 15 feet in the shell so that if one was damaged there would be 2 backups. The clones worked in twos, one carving and the other making sure there were no mistakes. While they did that, the original started using earth manipulation to dig under the top dome. He intended to create several different zones. Some for training areas, some for growing plants or raising livestock, and some for training areas. The best part was that depending on the seals he put in place around these zones, he could create the perfect environment. Uzu would be able to produce the best and rarest of goods, allowing the village to not only be independent but also a very influential exporter. The rock he cleared out was compacted into blocks for civilian-style building purposes. There was still a lot of work to do, but their heavy part was done. With clones working on the rest, it wouldn't take too long for Uzugakure to be ready to open its doors. That's all for now. If you enjoy, then please like, share and do comments.